Good day to you. My name is Matthew Wedd, and I'm the Operations Manager at the Conococheague Institute, a regional learning centre that focuses on the history of early America and the nature you can experience here as well. I'm dressed in clothes from over 200 years ago. I'm in a house. That's how people lived 200 years ago. And today, for the Alexander Hamilton Memorial Free Library, I'll be doing a children's story from 200 years ago. Now, my story, because it's an old book, doesn't have the pictures that modern children's stories do have. But hopefully, if we use our imagination and our mind, we can make this story come alive. The Conococheague Institute is located near Welsh Run. So our story is going to be a story from Wales. Wales is a country across the ocean, and Wales is famous for its storytellers about dragons, mermaids, and fairies. This story is a fairy tale from old Welsh legends, and it's called The Fairy Garden. In the mountains of Brecon in faraway Wales, there was once a small lake. And near this lake, there was a great big rock. And in the great big rock, there was a tiny little door. The door was open only one day a year in May. Anyone who wished to go through the door on that special day was allowed, be they adults, children, or even puppies. All they had to do was go down a secret passage through the door, and they ended up in an island in the center of a huge lake. On this island was the most exquisite garden that's possible to imagine. The flowers were of gorgeous colors and rare varieties, blooms like roses and tulips and daffodils. The fruit hung luscious, ripe and ready to pick from the trees. Bananas, apples, oranges, apple oranges, all sorts of fruit, some you've never seen. And the grass was so bright it could only be described as fairy green. As a matter of fact, the grass was indeed fairy grass, because this enchanting place was the home of the fairies. For those who didn't go through the door and stood on the edge of the lake, they could scarcely see the island, but sometimes they could hear music coming over the waters, and they could hear the song of the fairies. Guests who visited the fairy island on that special day in May were always made welcome by the fairies, and they enjoyed themselves greatly. They were given as much fruit as they could eat, and as many flowers as they could carry, and they could play fairy games and sing fairy songs with fairies flying around their heads. And they could decorate themselves with fairy clothes and fairy colors and fairy sprinkles and fairy magic. But their fairy hosts made just one special rule. None of those gifts could leave the island. Unfortunately, on one of those special days, one of the people who visited the island was a very greedy man, and he disobeyed the fairy's special rule, which is never a wise thing to do. He wanted to take one of the very special gifts the fairy had given him away from Fairy Island forever. And so, to take this gift away, he took a magnificent scarlet red flower. And when none of the fairies was looking, he slipped it inside his pocket, and he crept away up the secret passage, out of the secret door, out of the rock, and far away. But the second he left the fairy's magic, he fell asleep, he fell unconscious, he fell straight to the floor. And when he woke up, he looked inside his pocket, and the flower was gone. It had disappeared back to fairyland. Now, fairies are very smart, and they knew what he had done. They knew he had broken their rule and taken a gift. And while all the other kids and adults and puppies were still playing, they unfortunately had to say goodbye. The fairies said goodbye to all the adults and children and puppies, and they left Fairy Island. And the fairies closed the door in the great big rock forever. Thus did one man's greed deprive the rest of the people of the yearly pleasure of Fairy Island. Now, although we can never visit Fairy Island anymore, undoubtedly the fairies still play and sing and work in their lovely hidden garden, hidden somewhere in a rock, hidden somewhere in a lake, in the mountains of Brecon and Wales. You could probably still find the lake, and you may see a large rock, but for now, the door in the rock will remain forever closed to human eyes. I hope you enjoyed this old fairy tale about fairies. There are other stories in here about dragons and mermaids and bogies and wizards, but those are stories for another day. Goodbye.